Hello everyone, this is going to be yet another book review from my lovely work trailer. I've been here now over 2 weeks and it's been pretty slow work. It's starting just now to pick up, but I like that. It's been very good. It's allowed me ample time to engage in self-bettering activities, and of course high on my list in that is reading. And so I've finished 3 or 4 books since I've been here. I can't wait till I finish. I'm getting a little nervous that I'm going to actually read all of them that I have before I finish, and I'm going to have to figure out a way to get more to myself here before I'm done. But you know, in keeping with some of the other ones I've made here, I don't want this to strictly be a book review. I wanted also to just kind of be my thoughts on a topic. So let me turn the music down. My music. Sorry. That was not intentional. So many of you know I'm engaged in a prolonged study of China, the history of China, and I finished now the last dynasty, the Qing, and I'm about halfway done with the Ming. However, I initiated my study with the more modern era, with several books about Japan, but about the Japanese war with China, and then I read a biography on kai-shek, and I really do recommend for overviews of history to pick out biographies of important people, usually synonymous with evil people, not always though. It gives a good overview. You know, a typical lifespan is going to encompass, you know, the before and the after, and so, you know, World War II doesn't make a lot of sense except in the context of the many decades before that. However, a book that's just about World War II is probably not going to be able to cover that in detail, but you read a book about kai-shek and, you know, you're going to have to cover, you know, 50 years before you even get to that, even more than that. And it puts important events in the context that they belong in, which is their historical occurrences. And of course, in the case of Chiang in China, there's an obvious parallel point of view to come at it with, and that is, of course, Mao. The two were rivals for many years. There's not 100% overlap. There was a time when Chiang was not really, you know, he was really in charge, and Mao really was not. But then there was a period at the end where the opposite is true, where Chiang is in charge in Taiwan, and Mao is the undisputed ruler of China. The two were rivals, and I'll talk about their relationship, at least part of it, towards the end here. And so, you know, I really found myself reading this book, and I'll just give the name. It's Mao, The Untold Story by a married couple, Jun Chang and John Holliday. I don't have the paperback, but I don't know, I bought it used, and this is how it came, used. Now, this book, like any book, honestly, but explicitly with this book, is not objective. I think objectivity is kind of something to strive for, but is never achievable, and an honest writer, reporter, author, person will admit the biases that they have if they're trying to you know, explain something to someone, say this is the point of view that I'm coming from, or this is the point I'm trying to reach, and then people can assess that information on the understanding. And the one thing you'll notice if you read the book reviews on Amazon of this, and that's something I recommend people do, just to see, I've kind of noticed that there's if something's really controversial, you end up with this weird inverse where there's a lot of people who will rate it very highly, and then a lot of people who will rate it very low. And that's a good indication that it's a very partisan book, and that there's probably not a great deal of consensus. Whereas if you have a whole bunch of positive ratings and very, very few at the bottom, that's a good indication that, at least in popular culture, it's more of a consensus opinion. Now, it depends how many people read it. I'm sure, you know, Anthony C. Sutton's book, if they have any reviews, are going to have all positive, but that's only because only very few people have read them. You know, so Peter Schiff's books, you know, if you look at his have lots of highs and lots of low. He has many detractors. But if you say look at Jim Rogers' books, his many more high and many fewer lower rating ones, which I thought was very interesting. It's a very my math skills are failing me here, but the pattern is very clear. And this book definitely falls more towards it's partisan. However, reading some of the critiques of this, and I actually went online and read some of them, the people who most vehemently critique it are hardcore Marxists who have made a career extolling the virtues of Mao Zedong and the Communist Party in China. One particular Marxist in the UK, I forget his name, who is the author of a apparently very ponderous tome about communist guerrillas in southern China even before the Long March, that is ironically for sale for no less than $800 or $900 on Amazon. Imagine that, a Marxist whose books sell for that much, or at least are asking that much. The Holidays, John Holiday and Jun Chang, are explicitly critical of Mao. They are out to rebuke him as much as they can, and there are points when even for me, who's someone who agrees with that position, if we're going to talk about objectivity, by the way, you know, people who are out to condemn Mao versus people who are out to praise or at the very least excuse him, the ones that have a greater comprehension of reality, I think, are the former. I don't think there's any. I think it requires a huge amount of delusion, self-delusion, to start making excuses for Mao, even accepting that there's hyperbole and exaggeration in many of the charges leveled against him. That being said, I don't know if they have a personal axe to grind, but they definitely don't like him, and much of the narrative is kind of dedicated to explaining why these decisions that he made are selfish, or why they're bad, or why they're petty. There's a lot of many attempts to psychoanalyze him, which I think are interesting, but not necessarily, you know, true. It's very hard to know what he was really thinking. I found myself thinking several times, this is an interesting interpretation, but I wonder if there is other information that would make the context a little bit different. They do use a lot of source material where they go and they interview people all over the world, really. Former nationalists, former CIA people all over China. Apparently they both speak Chinese. I'm assuming that Jung Chang is ethnically Chinese. They talk to people who did Mao's laundry, people up from the Long March, high communist officials, people who worked in the Soviet Union, KGB officials, everybody from, like I said, peasants in Yan'an who did his laundry, all the way to Michael Caine, the actor, who apparently they interviewed him because he was in the Korean War and developed very strongly anti-communist views because of his experiences there, fighting the Chinese volunteers that invaded Korea. I almost thought that maybe they made the excuse to go interview him, but yes, I think that's a valid type of research. Not to say that circumstantial evidence can't be wrong, but to listen to how these people report it, and they do, to their credit. You know, sometimes they'll say, look, there is some debate here. I will say they do fall into a problem here, and I hate to point this out, because to say there are sometimes exaggerations when it comes to the atrocities of communists, it's very hard to say that without making it sound like there weren't actually atrocities, but indeed there were. However, there comes a point when you can't blame the communists or the USSR for every problem. And they don't do that, but there's a couple instances where they make an attempt to blame the USSR or the Communist Party on things that I rather doubt they can be attributed to. This is especially in regards to Japanese imperialism in China. Having now read about that conflict from four perspectives, Was it 4? Well, yeah, I've read it. I've read 2 books on it from the Japanese perspective: the Japanese Imperial Army and Power and Culture by Akira Irie. And then from the nationalist point of view in the biography on Chiang, and then now from the communist point of view on this biography on Mao. And there seems to be consensus among the 3, of the role of Japanese strategic interests and imperialism and fascism, if you want to call it that. Maybe that's not an applicable term, in things like the invasion of Manchuria and then much more importantly the invasion of China in 1937. They take the view that these were instigated by communists, and I think they cited, well, somebody, alleged this at some point, and while that is interesting, I think that is maybe giving it too much credence. The communists stand to be utterly rebuked, absolutely totally rebuked, for things we can demonstrate that they did. No need to risk talking about things that they simply may have done. Which is, I understand the impulse, but they're not guilty of everything. They're certainly not the only evil people who have ever existed in the 20th century. Maybe they are the most evil, perhaps. But it didn't send off alarm bells to the point of, okay, I'm going to ignore everything in this book. Just, they're a little too enthusiastic sometimes. And Rothbard is the same way. Many of you have, as much as we lionize, and I think deservedly lionize Rothbard, sometimes you have to wonder how much you can trust him on particular details. Not to the point where you would throw out everything, certainly not, but that's something to remember. But things that they could be interpreted differently, I think, make up only a small amount of the book. This would give you a very decent overview of 20th century Chinese history, especially in the period from, say the Long March up until Mao's ascension to power, and the first decade or a decade and a half of his reign, going up through the famine and the Cultural Revolution. And I have to admit, although I've known about Mao for many, many years, I knew very little, and this book provided an awful lot of context and an awful lot of quotes, to the point where I feel like I am better suited to understand and to ask the necessary questions about him, his rise to power, how he ruled, the power struggles within the Communist Party, which I knew they must have existed, but I took for granted their scope, and their effectiveness, which they weren't terribly effective, but they did exist. And rather than China just being this red evil empire, which I would consider the government to be that way, but I would consider most governments to be that way, it really gave me a lot of context and understanding that I didn't have before. Same with the book on Chiang. Chiang gives you a better, the biographies on Chiang are going to give you a much better understanding of, say, the 20s and 30s. Biographies on Mao are going to give you a better understanding of the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and maybe even a little bit to the 70s. So definitely I recommend this in the biography on Chiang. I don't remember the name. I think it's called China's Generalissimo and the Country He Lost, something like that. They're both good. They're good companion books, really, and they give you a decent understanding of most of Chinese history, modern history, anyway, connecting the dynastic period up until the modern period. So I did want to talk a little bit about Mao personally. I've always had this question in my mind, like, was this person a sincere Marxist who was simply honestly attempting to implement Marxism as he understood it? And of course it was disastrous. I already knew that. I'd read about the famine, made videos about the famine. Or was this a person who is power hungry and simply wants to be a dictator and is liquidating his enemies? And I think that the correct answer, if we're not going to be arbitrary about it or, say there's shades, it's definitely more towards the latter. My sense of it is that Marxism was only, his brand, but what he really cared about was power. Mao is an interesting, and there's a fundamental hypocrisy to Mao that you do notice even today. I notice it especially today with the demographic catastrophe people, those who say that there's too many humans, there's overpopulation. Anyone who says that and does not immediately slit their own throat is a hypocrite. And Mao is similar, not that he was an eco-terrorist, but because he has several early writings where he talks about death. Mao was a very avid reader. When he became old, he actually became blind, and this was a huge blow to him. He enjoyed reading, and he was interested in a lot of things. And he became interested in death, and he just thought, well, death isn't such a big deal. It's a very interesting thing. Nobody knows what happens after that, and wouldn't that be interesting? And so there's this kind of flippancy about people dying that it's, what's the big deal? Now, that would be fine if then he would be willing to die, but he went to extraordinary measures to ensure that he would not die. In fact, towards the end of his life, when there was essentially a coup, which I did not know, basically Deng Xiaoping rose up to, this is very late, you know, his last year or two of his life, to where he could have ousted Mao, and Mao basically said, just let me die, and when I die, go ahead and take revenge on everybody that you hate that's associated with me, up to and including his wife. There's the so-called Gang of Four who was kind of ruling. They were the Mao party at that point. This is very late in his life. He was in control up until that point. And he said, just please let me live. He wanted everyone else to die. His most faithful servants, people like Zhou Enlai and what's his name, Li Shaoqi. You know, these are people who did more for him than anybody else, and you know, he made these people die. He allowed these people to die. He actually made sure that they would die before him. So he took when he became the leader, he had you know, bunkers built. All of the places that he lived were, you know, bomb-proof, you know, earthquake-proof, air raid-proof. You know, he had food tasters, doctors with him all the time, wherever he went, as long as he was in a position to afford that luxury. So, you know, he really wanted to stay alive, but he didn't think it was a big deal if other people died. And he explicitly said this many times. You know, so what if there's a nuclear war? It only means millions of people will die. Big deal. So what if millions of people? This happened to the famine. People would say millions of people are dying. He's like, what's the big deal? They're all going to die someday anyway. They might as well die of edema right now as opposed to of, you know, heart failure when they're in their 70s. So, you know, he became like a newspaper editor, and at some point, you know, he joined the Communist Party relatively early, and at that point the Communist Party was, you know, just one of a plethora of essentially nationalist organizations. You know, this last dynasty of China, the Qing, were Manchus. They were not ethnically Chinese, and there's been a lot of people who say that they were Sinified, that they had become Chinese, and that happened to a point, but only to a point. And of all the reforming ideas that were in late imperial China, and indeed in the post-imperial age, you know, the only thing that everybody agreed in is that the Manchus have to go, at least in terms of political power. They didn't want to lose Manchuria, though. They kept that. And if you watch CCT today, they refer to Manchuria as a part of China, which is kind of interesting if you're talking about pre-dynastic period. Anyway, you know, there were many, many political parties. Now, the most important was the nationalists, which eventually became under the domination of Chiang. And the nationalists were by far the most powerful government within China. Now, at no point in Chiang's reign did he come to control the entire country. After the breakup of the dynastic period, all the areas of the periphery kind of fell into the sphere, either localism or the spheres of other great powers. Most importantly, and most especially in the northeast, Manchuria became heavily influenced both by the Russians and then even more by the Japanese. The Japanese had major interest there before they annexed the area and created the puppet state of Manchukuo in 1931. But even out in western China, in Tibet, and Shanxi, which is the province that borders Mongolia and Kazakhstan, these essentially became part of the Soviet Union or Russia. You know, southern provinces basically became independent warlordism. But, you know, Chiang was the main guy, and the Communist Party was relatively small. But Mao saw in this a place for him to become king of a small hill, so to speak. And everything that he did, so to speak, everything that he did was aimed towards becoming the hegemon within the Communist Party. And it took the better part of 20 years for that to happen. But eventually, by sacrificing the interests of the party, and not to mention millions of people at every chance that he got, and by placating the man, essentially, that was necessary who was the kingmaker of the Chinese Communist Party, and of course that man was Joseph Stalin. The Communist Party was very helpless and dependent on the Soviet Union, and whoever Stalin favored would become, the de facto most important person. And Stalin was, of course, himself a great schemer and was not interested in having there be a hegemon in the CCP. But eventually, this did develop with Mao. It's interesting, Chiang. The Civil War, the understanding of the Civil War and the Long March in the West is very much colored by the communist version of events, even though the nationalists weren't all eliminated and they've had, a voice this entire time. The way I was taught the Long March, and I was taught it in high school, was very much the communist view. Having read Chiang's book and also this, it seems very clear that Chiang allowed the communists to exist at this point for two very specific reasons. One, his son was in the custody of the Soviet Union. Before he had us falling out with the Soviet Union, Chiang actually visited. When he came back, he said that he would never trust the Soviets, which is, I'm not some huge Chiang fan, but he's right about that. But his son was there, and his son was essentially held hostage. He would ask for his son to be returned, and Stalin would say no. Essentially what Chiang did is he told Stalin, in a very indirect way, that if he got his son back, he would allow the communists to exist. He would not crush them. He had them... there had been a back and forth. You don't want to give the impression that the communists had not fought, and sometimes effectively, but the overwhelming majority of the power was in Chiang's hands, and he had it within his grasp to destroy them, and he let them go in return for his son. The other thing that he wanted to do was establish his control over other parts of China that were still under local control, especially the province of Sichuan, which even today is the most populous province within China. It has 100 million people today. Back then it would have been more like 30 million, but still a huge area, a huge food-producing area, very mountainous area. And it was under the control of a warlord. And had Chiang simply entered on his own accord, he would have had to fight a very grueling war with this warlord. I think he probably would have won, but he had a bigger fish to fry, and he realized it made sense to allow the communists to escape into Sichuan, and then the warlord would have to ask him to try and deal with them and essentially invite his armies in rather than fight his way in. And he used this tactic in several places, allowing the communists to retreat and then using that as a pretext to enter and establish control. And so the communists in the Long March, ironically, were acting as kind of a vanguard to allow nationalist control over the central and western parts of China that they hadn't already established domination over. But eventually Mao became the most important person. Now, I don't want to go into all the details, but he betrayed and eliminated all of his rivals, not always to death. There were people like Li Shaoqi and Zhou Enlai who were very powerful, and that they simply subordinated themselves to him. They did not have the willingness, the lust for power or for blood to be as aggressive as he was, and they subordinated themselves to him. Once he became head of the Communist Party, obviously the most important thing for him then was to become the head of the rest of China. By the time he was the head of the Communist Party, and not officially the head, but de facto the most powerful person within the party, World War II had begun. Of course, all the nationalists in China, I don't just mean the party, wanted all Chinese people to rise up and fight the Japanese. And actually, Chiang got in a lot of trouble because he resisted doing this. Chiang had his reasons. He realized that they would be no match for the Japanese, and he wanted to prepare until they had an army that could at least have a good showing in the field and then fight the Japanese. I think, which is probably the only practical thing he could have done. But there was enormous pressure for him to attack the Japanese. In fact, he was kidnapped by Zhang Julin, who was the son of the warlord of Manchuria, whose murder propagated precipitated the Japanese occupation of Manchuria. He was actually kidnapped by this son of a warlord who lived to be 100 and ended up living in Hawaii, of all things, after become addicted to opium. Chiang was kidnapped for not fighting the Japanese thoroughly enough, and this kind of forced him to fight a war with Japan. And at the same time, the Soviet Union also wanted the war with Japan to go ahead, because they figured if Japan was fighting the Chinese, they would not be fighting the Soviet Union. This was a correct assumption on the part of the Soviet Union. And Stalin began giving orders that the communists should join in the war against Japan, which essentially they almost never did. There were many communists who wished to do this, who wanted to fight the Japanese, who were eager to do so. But Chiang saw there was no point in doing that. They would simply get wiped out. In the end, it would be better to simply let his two enemies fight each other. And that's exactly what happened. And when people talk about war making you stronger, I would highly recommend they look at the case of China fighting Japan. The Chinese and the Japanese fighting did not make either of them stronger. They were horrendously destructive affairs, not only for the populations and societies at large, but even for the states. The nationalist state was horribly weakened by the war with Japan, and the communist state, which abstained by and large, with one major exception that was kind of forced on them from any of the fighting. When the fighting ceased, there was a strong... Chiang immediately wanted to destroy the communists, and probably could have done so. There was a very strong impetus from the United States, of all places, to have there be some kind of truce. There was a lot of disaffection with Chiang, which is understandable. Chiang had many problems. We could go on and on about them, but what we can say is that none of them even come close to what was going to end up happening under Mao. I don't think there's any argument about that. But the Americans said you two should get along. They basically refrained Chiang to the point that they helped Chiang's armies. He was supplied by the Americans. The Americans moved several armies for him, and it looked as though the communists were going to be completely driven out of China. And then when they were only a few hundred miles from the Soviet border, occupying a single city, Mukden, in Manchuria, the Americans basically put their foot down and said, you cannot extinguish them. That will anger the Soviets. We're pissed at you. You owe us money, blah, 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 blah. And they were allowed to endure and then receive enormous aid from the Soviets. And in a very interesting civil war, which involved a lot of people who were nationalists but who were actually communist agents, the communists came to power. Now, Mao, once he got in power, his new ambition was to rule the world. Like, people talk about the Nazi ambition to rule the world, or the Japanese ambition to rule the world, and certainly with the Japanese, that was not their goal. I don't think that was the goal with Hitler either. People talk about his second book. I don't know. When you read Mein Kampf, that doesn't seem to be what he was aiming for. When you look at what they were attempting to establish, it was a hegemonic Western Eurasian state that didn't even include all of Western Europe. Not world domination, simply autocratic hegemony. A state similar in scope to the United States or the European section of the USSR. Mao did want to rule the world, and he looked at China as simply his base to achieve that. And things like the famine that happened later are directly a result of his ambitions to become a dominant world superpower, which, I'm glad to say, completely he failed in his lifetime. The stuff that's happened since then, it cannot be attributed to Mao, and Mao would not be aware of it, and I am glad that when he died, he would have failed in this. The first thing he tried to do is he subordinated everything to the military. Education, agriculture, all government expenditures that were possible went to two things: the military and also to foreign aid. They were huge into foreign aid, and this was simply to buy influence, especially with Eastern Bloc countries, but also many others. The Soviet Union was goaded into giving them technology on several occasions. Basically, Mao would fire artillery shells at Taiwan or some of the islands that are part of Taiwan that are close to China, or they're not really part of Taiwan, but they're occupied by nationalists. The Americans would say, we're upset about this, and then Mao would go to the Russians and say, I think the Americans are going to attack me with nuclear weapons. If you don't want to get in a nuclear war, why don't you give me nuclear weapons, and then I'll be able to do it without you getting involved. And eventually, and this is something that, of course, Stalin would never have allowed, but Stalin was dead after 1953. And Khrushchev eventually started to help. And the Chinese bomb that was detonated in Lop Nur in 1964 was almost entirely a creation of the Soviet Union. All the scientists, all the material. The site itself, Lop Nur, was actually selected by the Soviets. I always knew that the Chinese had developed an atom bomb. I didn't realize that it was essentially given to them by the Soviet Union, although that wouldn't surprise me. This is yet another example of, the power of communism. Here they're copying another communist state, and itself is everything is secondhand from the West, as Anthony C. Sutton has demonstrated so brilliantly in his book, Western Technology and Soviet Economic Development. Another thing, though, is to get this military aid, and it wasn't just nuclear, it was all kinds, fighter jets, which also, interestingly enough, the Chinese weren't able to manufacture. They would build them, and they would give them to other countries like Poland, and then they would tell them, please don't fly these, they don't actually work, which is hilarious. But, Mao went to the Russians, and they said, listen, we want all this technology, but the Russians, of course, aren't superpower, really. They're not rich. They can't have this much of their technology going to China, and Mao said, look, we don't have anything to give you, really. We don't really make anything, but we do have a lot of food. And so the state acquisition and diverting of grain to the Soviet Union was explicitly and directly a result of Mao essentially buying his military industrial complex in whole from the Soviet Union, and buying political influence all over the world. He was explicitly on what he called the superpower program. He wanted China to be a superpower, and if tens of millions, and it was many tens of millions of Chinese died, he did not care. And if the ones who lived had more impoverished lives than they had ever had, either during the war with Japan or under the nationalists, or under the Qing, or even under the Han, or the Qin, that was fine. He did not give two shits if tens of millions of Chinese people died. If it would satisfy his ambition. The whole idea of Maoism is just another example of his vanity. He wasn't really an ideologue. He wasn't really... His use of Marxist rhetoric was very, very superficial. And not to say this is a great... Well, Marx was a separate topic, but he wanted a cult of personality because he thought it would help make him a famous person, and it did to a point, but really not many people were heavily influenced. The communist world was dominated by the USSR. At some point in the 70s, after the signing of one of the SALT treaties, Brezhnev and Ford or Nixon, said we're in the age where the world is dominated by two states, the US and the USSR, and that absolutely infuriated Mao. He became very dejected when it became apparent that in his lifetime, and when he was in his mid-60s, he started saying, look, if we start working really hard in 10, 15 years, we can be a superpower. We can overtake the U.S. He used to say we were going to take over Britain in a very superficial way, that they were going to produce more iron or whatever. And eventually he began to realize this is not going to happen, and not in his lifetime. And eventually he purged so many of his enemies, especially in the Cultural Revolution, that it became very difficult to even run society, and he was at risk of things just falling apart. And so he had to come back to people who he had purged, who he had maybe not necessarily killed, but had, thrown into, ruralization, where they're out, picking crops or whatever, and bring them back. And one of these people was Deng Xiaoping, who had been forced into a factory. And I'm not going to just talk about how great Deng Xiaoping is, because I don't think that he was. But if Mao had an avenger, you know, this man was the closest thing that we get to it. Deng came back into the government and basically started undoing many of the most draconian things that Mao was doing, and said, look, you know, you're old, you're feeble. He actually had Lou Gehrig's disease, which I didn't realize, and actually apparently Mao did not realize he had Lou Gehrig's disease. The doctors diagnosed him and did not tell him. And they did tell Deng, they told Zhou Enlai, and this actually emboldened them. They all realized that this man, Mao, is going to be dead in not too long. He lived into his 80s, so it's not like it really robbed him of too much of his life, unfortunately. But yeah, eventually he was on a bed, just begging, just leave me, please leave me in power until I die, and they did. But it's nice to know at least that he realized that he wasn't really in control anymore and that he had failed. And it is interesting the degree to which China has reached goals that he wanted but never achieved. It is only by abandoning his practices. And you know, people have asked me, this probably deserves its own video, but like, what about the argument about the super effective, super ruthless tyrant? Like Genghis Khan is the kind of the quintessential example, but Mao could be another. I think that since the Industrial Revolution, anyone who behaves in that way is retarding their society to the point that they will not be able to compete with others. You know, Mao would say things like, no one will, the only thing he could really kind of latch onto was the population of China, and be like, I'm powerful because the population of China is huge, which of course was A, not something he did, and B, something that he did a great deal to destroy by killing tens of millions, indirectly anyway. And he would say things like, no one would dare invade China, and I'm thinking he must be a moron for saying that. How can somebody in China in the mid-50s or the mid-60s say nobody would invade China, when China had endured an 8 to 14-year invasion, depending on how you look at it, from the Japanese, that, you know, conquered a huge swath of the country and killed tens of millions or millions of people. You know, China had been invaded within his lifetime by the Russians, by the other European powers, before that by the Mongols many times, by the Manchus and by the Japanese, and could have been invaded many other times. You know, the more I've read about China, the less I fear them as a nation state, as a threat to the world. Granted, things change, and so I'm not saying that's impossible, but their power projection abilities beyond, you know, Vietnam and Korea are pretty limited historically. You know, and there are some major societies between them and anyone we need to worry about before. But, you know, people who are so tyrannical that they have no respect for human rights, they destroy all incentive for productivity within their societies. Productivity of the type that's competitive. You know, you can whip someone to be a slave, but that's not going to give them the entrepreneurial incentive to better allocate resources. Yes, to use their physical labor, but to create net gains? No. Because they won't reap any of that reward, and you can't prove that they didn't come up with the idea. And so all they can do is watch themselves lag behind, and that's what happened. You know, had it not been for the subsidies given them from the Soviet Union, they would have been at nationalist levels of technology up until he died. And it was only until, you know, market forces were unleashed to a degree that they hadn't been under Mao that things really started to change, gradually at first, more later. That's, I think, a separate, more interesting, more involved topic. But yeah, I don't think that he was, I mean, he used Marxism, that was his brand and his label. He tied his identity to it, but I think he was mostly interested in power and his own self-aggrandizement. It's actually very similar to FDR. FDR was very interested in World War II and fighting in World War II and getting involved. Not because he really thought that Germany was a threat. He may have thought that, but I doubt it. What he was really interested in was the realization that that would make him a great president, because he knew that anyone who fought at war would be a great president. He also knew that he wouldn't have to suffer for it, that he would not be the one bleeding on the beaches of Normandy or Peleliu or Okinawa or Iwo Jima, that it wouldn't be him that had to do all that. He could live in the White House or in Warm Springs, Georgia, getting massaged in his hot springs because he had polio and couldn't walk because he was a deceitful cripple, but yet he would get all the credit, and he did. You know, like, we still talk, and I don't want to make this an FDR video, but it's people like Mao is someone who was smart enough to realize this is what would happen, and that's what he wanted. And it didn't matter how many tens of millions of people died in the process. It didn't matter at all. Now, as much as that's an indictment of him, it's even more of an indictment of the people who then use him as some kind of thing to emulate, which unfortunately is still a problem we have. So books like this are still useful. Reading them is still useful, and examining it is still a worthwhile activity. So I think I'll call that it for this, and I'll talk to you all next time.